Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today called Let's Talk About Opioids. My name is Carrie Lascala, and I'm the Associate Director of Health Literacy at Wisconsin Health Literacy. And presenting with me today is my coworker, Caitlin Mowat, who is a Health Communication Specialist at Wisconsin Health Literacy. To participate in today's webinar, you should have a copy of the Let's Talk About Opioids workbook in front of you, as well as the Let's Talk About Opioids facilitator script and frequently asked questions. We'll be using those and referring to those later in the webinar. Before we begin, just a little bit about Wisconsin Health Literacy. We're a statewide nonprofit organization, and we offer education and training on health literacy throughout the state of Wisconsin. We do a lot of community-based projects, such as the one we're talking about today. We've done something similar in the past called Let's Talk About Pain Medicines to the community in general, and that referred mostly to prescription opioids, and there's a little bit of overlap with that in the Let's Talk About Opioids project today. We've also done workshops and presentations on medication use in general. We're doing one right now where we're helping seniors and adults find reliable health information online, as well as another one with Alzheimer's and health literacy. We're a division of Wisconsin Literacy, and that is comprised of over 70 members. It's a coalition of literacy services across the state of Wisconsin, and they provide literacy services to those in their community, and we help those coalition members. We have a health literacy summit every other year, and our website is right there at the bottom of the page. This just shows a little bit of what we do in some of our programs and our other initiatives. So today's agenda, I'm going to talk about health literacy a little bit and what it's about, and also the topic of why we're focusing this project on opioids for those for justice-involved individuals. And then Caitlin's going to get into the nuts and bolts of the Let's Talk About Opioids project. So health literacy at a glance. I could probably talk about health literacy all day long, but that's not the purpose of today's webinar. So I'm going to start you off with a quiz, but it's nothing you have to write down. It's just something to think about. Which of the following is the single strongest predictor of an individual's health status? I'll give you a couple seconds to answer that question. Okay, if you guessed literacy skills, that was right. These other things on the slide are also predictors of an individual's health status, but literacy skills is the strongest predictor of somebody's health status. And the traditional definition of health literacy is the degree to which an individual has the capacity to obtain, communicate, process, and understand basic health information and services to make appropriate health decisions. So those keywords, are they able to obtain, communicate, process, and understand basic health information so that they can make appropriate health decisions? We at Wisconsin Health Literacy, we also think of it as there are two sides to health literacy. So in this top bullet, this refers to all of us because we're all patients. So what is our ability to access, understand, and use health information? And then the second bullet point refers to another person's ability to clearly communicate how to access, understand, and use health information for better health. So that other person might be a healthcare provider, it might be someone in social services, it might be you, it might be me. We might be helping someone with their health information, whether those we work with or those in our family or friends. And so what is our ability to clearly communicate this information? Health literacy means a person is able to understand these sorts of things, but can they understand what the instructions on a prescription bottle are? Can they find the date on their appointment slip? Are they able to sign consent forms or read medical brochures? Can they navigate a complex healthcare system? Are they able to understand and use their insurance benefits? There are so many examples of people who might struggle or how health literacy can impact somebody. And one example, we can give you an example of low health literacy was there was a couple and they were elderly and the gentleman had Alzheimer's and his wife was trying to give him some medicine for an ear infection, and she was supposed to give him this liquid medication orally, but when she was reading the prescription instructions, she couldn't find how she was supposed to administer the medication, and so she ended up putting the medication in his ear. So there are lots of stories like that, and there are lots of situations like that where people don't understand their health information and they do things that can be really harmful to them. So this project specifically talks about justice-involved individuals and using opioids. And when we talk about justice-involved individuals, we're talking about those who have been incarcerated or otherwise involved with the criminal justice system. So inmates, once they leave prison within the first 2 weeks, they're 129 times more likely to die from a drug overdose. So that's any drug overdose. They're 129 times more likely than those in the general population to die from a drug overdose within the first 2 weeks after release. And interestingly enough, they are 40 times more likely to die from an opioid overdose alone. So this study was done out of North Carolina. So the previous slide showed they're 129 times more likely from any drug overdose. This one shows that they're 40 times more likely to die from an opioid overdose alone. And there are many reasons for that. One is if they were using opioids before they got into jail or prison and then stopped using it for the time that they were incarcerated and then started using it again after they left, their tolerance is going to be a lot lower than prior to when they were incarcerated. There are other risk factors as well. Once they leave prison, they may have limited access to healthcare, especially at the beginning. They may have trouble seeking mental health resources or medication-assisted treatment. There's a lot of instability when you leave prison. They may not have employment to go back to, or may not have had any prior and now are trying to find employment again. They may not have a home to go to. There are also many effects or suffering effects of trauma. Many of those who have been incarcerated have suffered childhood trauma or trauma later in life, and being in prison or incarcerated alone is a traumatic experience. And then finally, there are a lot of synthetic opioids now. So a lot of street drugs such as marijuana, meth, cocaine, or whatever the street drug may be, they're laced with synthetic opioids, fentanyl, carfentanil, and so they're making the drugs even more dangerous than they already are. So I'm going to give an introduction about the Let's Talk About Opioids project before turning it over to Caitlin. The why behind the project, it's to help justice-involved individuals, those 18 and older, understand the risk of opioid overdose upon release, as well as resources, including alternative types of treatment. Normally, when we do a session, we have 15 to 30 people in the session, but you can change that to whatever is best for your facility. You can have more than that, you can have fewer than that, and that's fine, whatever works best. They're usually about 90 minutes long, and that's a great amount of time because it helps you go through the material at a decent pace, but yet still have time for questions and a lot of dialogue back and forth. This grant initiative is supported by the Wisconsin Department of Health Services Minority Health Program. So some of the topics you see here, talking about the differences between opioid medicines and other pain medicines. When we worked with the Let's Talk About Pain Medicines workshop and project that I was telling you about earlier, there were a lot of people who didn't know what an opioid was. And so that's just really important. So we start out just talking a little bit about the differences between opioid medicines and other pain medicines. We also talk about the different forms of opioids or the ways in which they can take those opioids. Talk about the potential dangers of using opioids when re-entering, some of those things I just talked about. The potential danger of taking opioids with other medicines. For example, if someone is taking an opioid prescription that also has acetaminophen in it, and then they were to take Tylenol later, they could potentially have too much acetaminophen in their bodies, and it could cause them to have liver damage, and they could potentially die from that. So we talk about things like that. We talk about trauma and its impact on opioid use, how to keep others safe, and to get rid of unused medications when you're done. There's a study out there that showed that young adults who turn to heroin, most of them had started out with the medications, the opioid medications they had found in their homes. Well, we also talk about the signs of an overdose and what to do in the workshop, and preventing an overdose with recovery resources and available treatment options. Again, Caitlin's going to go through all of those in just a few minutes. The workshop materials, we write those with health literacy principles in mind. And so we write them in plain language or easy to understand language. And just to also stay here, it's really great if when you're presenting the material, if you can speak in plain language yourself and use easy to understand language, talk in short sentences. It just makes it a lot easier for everybody to be able to understand the information. Going back to our written materials, we use a lot of white space. You'll be able to see that as you look through the workbook. Larger font size, we use pictures that reinforce the message. So just again, trying to make this as easy for everybody to understand as possible. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Carrie. Okay, so let's get into the workbook now. A few things to stress before we begin. First, please keep your dialogue as interactive as possible. You want to ask your audience lots of questions. This will not only keep people engaged, but in addition to learning from you, they will learn a lot from one another. Second, be sure to read the facilitator script and frequently ask question dialogue along with the workbook prior to when you present the workshop. Although the workbook provides the basis for the workshop, the facilitator script gives more information than we could really fit into the workbook and is a good practice for yourself. Last but not least, share your stories if you can. We'll share some examples of this as we go through the workbook, but feel free to share ones that you know too. Having said that, let's get started and turn to page 2 of the workbook. Here we start by talking about opioids and other pain medicines. You will discuss differences between opioids and non-opioids, how these medicines work differently in the body, what are the most common generic names versus brand names, and how prescription opioid medicines can be as addictive as heroin. Remember to ask questions throughout this page, such as, can you list any generic opioid medicines? Or what is the brand name of naproxen? Those are just a couple examples, but feel free to come up with your own. Let's turn to page 3 of the workbook. Here we are going to talk about the different ways to take opioids and dive deeper into discussing tolerance, dependence, and addiction. To start, briefly ask what ways an opioid may be taken, and then mention anything missed. The next section on tolerance, dependence, and addiction can bring up many stories participants want to share. This can create good conversation. If you are limited time, politely segue back into the presentation if needed. It is important to emphasize how two things will happen if you take opioids long enough: tolerance and dependence. If you have a story to share as well, this could be a good time to do that. It does not have to be opioid related, but focus on tolerance and dependence. Something that does not have a time limit for how long to take opioids is addiction. You can become addicted right away or at a later time. You could ask, what are some problems an opioid addiction can cause? And talk about how it ruins your life and all other problems. Be clear and to the point when you talk about how opioids can make a person stop breathing and die. Ask the participants if they know why this happens. The reason is opioids is a depressant and slows down your breathing. It can do so to the point that you pass out and die. Let's go ahead and turn to page 4. Here we discuss the dangers of taking opioids with other medicines and also with alcohol. For alcohol, ask what can happen if you take these on the same day. Like opioids, alcohol also slows down your breathing. You can stop breathing and die. This is true for cough medicines that also have alcohol in them. Remind them to check labels for alcohol. Benzos, ask the group, what are these used for? What do they treat? The answer is anxiety. Go through some of the examples. Explain that these also slow down your breathing and you can die if these are taken together. Then talk about acetaminophen. Ask, what is the brand name for acetaminophen? The answer is Tylenol. Ask, what happens if you take too much acetaminophen? It can damage your liver and you can die. Acetaminophen is sometimes an included ingredient on a prescription opioid. Sometimes it is not labeled, or it is written as ACE, So it's important to emphasize don't take acetaminophen or Tylenol on days that you are taking an opioid medicine unless your doctor or pharmacist tells you it is okay. If you want to take another pain reliever, ask your doctor or pharmacist first. Other medicines. The main thing we are stressing on this part of the page is that they must ask their doctor or pharmacist before they take any other medicine with their opioids. This includes what was already discussed and also any prescriptions, over-the-counter medicines, any herbals, plants, or other home remedies. Now we are going to move to page 5 of the workbook, where we talk about why those who are incarcerated are at such a high risk of an opioid overdose. Here, explain that there are a lot of deaths from opioid overdose every day in the U.S., but those who are incarcerated are particularly at risk, especially in the first 2 weeks. Ask why. And as Carrie mentioned earlier in the presentation, the answers are a person's tolerance decreases while incarcerated. Also, fentanyl and other stronger opioids are being laced in street drugs. And then there's the effects from trauma. You can explain that we'll be talking about fentanyl trauma later in the workshop. Page 6, synthetic opioids. Ask if you know what a synthetic opioid is compared to a natural one. Explain the difference. Talk about fentanyl here, and look at the image at the bottom of the page and discuss how much more powerful it is compared to other drugs shown. This image at the bottom was shared in a publication from researchoutreach.org showing that just 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be deadly. You also want to talk about carfentanil and discuss how this is supposed to be used for large elephants and not for people. Emphasize that this is used to tranquilize elephants. Explain why it's so important to know about synthetic opioids, as there's a good chance that street drugs are laced with one or the other, or both. Let's move on to page 7, which talks about the street drugs. The images shown were talked about earlier in the workbook, addressing the different ways you can take opioids. Now ask the participants to look at these pictures and let them know that any of those drugs, no matter what way you take them, can be laced with fentanyl. In fact, most heroin in the US is laced with fentanyl, and it can also be mixed with other drugs such as cocaine, meth, marijuana, etc. Fentanyl is so dangerous because it cannot be mixed evenly with other drugs. The analogy at the bottom of this page is really useful. It was shared from an individual at one of the focus groups we did to create this workbook. Now we're going to turn to page 8 of the workbook to explain how trauma can impact opioid use. During the creation of these materials, this section hit home with a lot of people. One person in the focus group said, after reading this page of the workbook, that a lot of the things make more sense to him now. This was good and powerful response. Go through the list and be sure to point out that being incarcerated is a traumatic experience. Explain what trauma can do. Discuss the statistic at the bottom of the page stating 5 or more experiences as a kid means that a person is 7 to 10 times more at risk for self-medicating and the importance of seeking treatment. Share how it is okay to seek treatment. Let's turn to page 9 and discuss the topic of keeping others safe. Start off this page by sharing the fact that Carrie mentioned earlier that most kids who turned to heroin started out using the opioid prescriptions they found at home. Children have died from accidentally swallowing opioids. They have died from putting patches on their bodies thinking they were stickers. Pets have also died. This happens because of the painkillers they found at home. Stress that all opioids must be locked and away from children. The best option is a lockbox, and there are resources out there, such as many health departments that offer free lockboxes. Then talk about the importance of getting rid of unused medicines. Go over the website listed and let them know that they can also ask a pharmacist. Okay, let's turn to page 10 and talk about the signs of an opioid overdose and about naloxone, the drug that saves lives. Ask them what the signs are and go over any that are missed. You can also ask them what is not a sign. The answer for this is a rapid heartbeat. Next, go over the drug naloxone. You can ask a lot of questions here to be interactive, such as, what is it? How does it work? What else is it called? Who can administer it? How can you get it? Why must they still go to the ER after being administered naloxone? Here you want to emphasize how important it is for the person giving naloxone to call 911. They should not drive the person there. Also, talk about the Good Samaritan law. The full law is in the facilitator script provided. Lastly, make sure you let the participants know where they can get it. At a pharmacy, a needle exchange program, or you could do some research yourself and let them know of places they can go locally. Remind them they may have to watch a short video to be trained on giving naloxone and also receive a free prescription, but it is worth it. Moving on to page 11 of the workbook on how to prevent an overdose. This is probably the most important page of the workbook. The most obvious way to prevent an overdose is not to use. Again, this was advice shared from someone at a focus group. If this is challenging, there is help out there, and they can find recovery services by calling 211 or texting their zip code. They could seek therapy and also take medications that are available so their bodies don't need an opioid. Examples are naltrexone, Vivitrol, Suboxone, and methadone. Stress that research shows the most effective way to treat opioid addiction is a combination of group or individual therapy and medication-assisted treatment. But also a higher risk of overdose is taking these medications. Then talk about how to lower their risk if they do take opioids. First, they never want to use alone. There's also the option to use fentanyl testing strips. It's also recommended to have naloxone with them and to let people know they have it. For the fentanyl test strips, emphasize they must read the directions well. It will differ per type of drug. They must test every individual amount of the drug they will use. Fentanyl test strips tell you there's fentanyl in it, but not how much. If they're interested in getting fentanyl test strips, they can get them through the needle exchange program or call 211 and ask where they can get them in their community. Remind them it takes time and effort to test, but this can save their life. To find Wisconsin resources, you can call 211 from any phone, text your zip code to 898211, or do online searches and chat rooms. On the back page is another reminder about calling 211, a statewide resource. Included in the workshop is a card activity set. This serves as a review of the workshop and another way to mix things up and have some fun. You can either read all of them aloud to the group and discuss the answers together, or if you're running out of time, just select a few to read to the group and discuss. The next 4 slides show fact sheets that you can share with each participant at the end of the workshop. We don't usually discuss these in the workshop, but give them to the participants to take back with them. The first 2 fact sheets are resources. We couldn't fit all the resources onto one page, so that's why you'll see 2 of them. The next 2 focus on topics that were in the workshop: the increased risk of death from opioids and the signs of an opioid overdose. If allowed, you can consider incentives. Some examples could be to offer GED workbooks from New Readers Press, or offer a free GED test for them to complete. You could also look at giveaways such as magazines and novels, or if there's an option, you can credit their account. Or maybe you have some other ideas that would offer as an incentive. If you're looking to do assessments, you can do the pre and post survey provided. Here's an example for the post survey. The pre-survey has the same questions 1 through 6, and then 7 and 8 are only added for the post survey. This is to compare what participants learned during the workshop. Carrie reviewed this earlier, and here's a recap to help make sure your presentation is engaging and the most beneficial. Use plain language. Again, not only written, but also when you are talking. Keep it interactive. We talked about a lot of questions today that you can ask the participants, the card activity game, maybe come up with some other ways if you want to keep them engaged. Ask a lot of questions, listen to their answers. You will learn something new every time, and keep it moving. We went over a lot of content today and showed multiple materials used in the workshop. Here is the full list of materials. You have the workbook, fact sheets, which included 4 fact sheets, the card activity game, an instructor script, which you should have in front of you, pre and post surveys, and then you can have incentives, which are optional. We appreciate you joining us for today's presentation. Please contact us with any questions you may have. Thank you.